The biggest area of need in security is really on the enterprise side. Individuals don't really think that much about their own security, but for enterprises, that's a real issue, and that's something that costs them a lot of money. If you try to implement security without taking the end user experience into account, then you're going to run into all sorts of problems. It either won't be adopted or, even worse, people will use it and be miserable. People care about privacy and they care about security, but they also care about convenience. You want to make it as easy as possible for a company to do business with you.
You're listening to the Enterprise Ready podcast, a show aiming to change the enterprise software narrative from how to sell to enterprises to how to build for enterprises. We'll interview industry experts and enterprise software founders as we break through the jargon, establish a common vernacular, and share the lessons learned from building the world's best enterprise software. Hi, I'm Grant Miller, creator of Enterprise Ready and founder and CEO of Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications. Check us out at replicated.com. The Enterprise Ready podcast is brought to you by Heavybit, a program dedicated to helping startups take their developer products to market. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just learn more about enterprise features, find us at enterpriseready.io. In this episode of the Enterprise Ready podcast, I interview John Whaley, founder and CTO of UnifyID. We start off by getting a bit about John's early career, focused on Mocha 5, the company he founded stemming from research he did during his doctoral program at Stanford. This leads us to an interesting discussion about monetizing university research and the process by which that is accomplished. We also dive into the product and company lifecycle of Mocha 5, understanding all the twists and turns and pivots that they made along the way while raising $84 million in venture. Eventually, we make our way to John's current company, UnifyID, which again came out of research he was doing and is now commercializing. UnifyID approaches authentication differently by adding additional context to login attempts. We'll go deep into their tech and all the various use cases, so you'll hear all about it. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, John, thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Let's just jump right in. Tell us a little bit about your background and sort of how you got into enterprise software.
Yeah, let's see. So I did my undergrad at MIT. I did my undergrad and my master's there. And then I worked at IBM Research for a while on compilers, like Java compilers. This is back in like the late 90s to 2000s. And then I started my PhD at Stanford. And that's really, at Stanford, that's where I really got into security. I was always into security before that, just in terms of just very interested in security and hacking. And, I would participate in various, capture the flag and like these type of events and stuff. But like, that's where I really got into security. And then through, the biggest area of need in security is really on the enterprise side. Individuals don't really think that much about their own security, but for enterprises, that's a real issue, and that's something that costs them a lot of money. And so that's how I got into enterprise. I was doing my PhD there. We had a research project that we then spun out into a company. It was called Mocha 5. That was back in 2005. Worked on that for 10 years. That eventually got acquired and then left there and then started a new company, UnifyID, which is where I am currently.
Cool. Okay. So you studied computer science in undergrad and then, you said you worked about a year at IBM.
Yeah. I did some summer internships and then I worked about a year there at IBM Research. And it was really, this was IBM Research. So it was very like research focused. And that's really like the community that I came from was really this kind of academia, like, research, like we would publish papers and do these type of things. That's where my original background was from. And then it was really when, after starting the company back in 2005, what had happened was that I was originally planning to be a professor and go into academia. I had some interviews and I didn't get the faculty jobs that I was really going after. So that's where, I took a step back and said, what's really important to me? And then, it was really all about impact. And then, had an opportunity at that point to help start a company. I thought, that's a cool opportunity. So then decided to jump on it and take it. And then, haven't looked back since then. I did go back to Stanford for a bit to become a lecturer. And, since then I've just been very much in enterprise software.
Cool. Okay. So you're at Stanford. You said you worked on some compiler stuff at IBM, so not really in the security context yet. Mm-hmm. And then you went to Stanford. And what triggered your interest in security while you're at Stanford?
Well, I was always generally interested in security, not so much in the enterprise context, but just, in terms of, security of systems, because I was very much into systems, like everything, networking, operating systems, and much of my research area I was doing static analysis, which is basically you analyze code mm-hmm. to, help find bugs. And one of the areas you also use it for is to find security holes, like things like SQL injection attacks or, buffer overruns or like these other type of things, which like bugs which are very important, like, and were becoming increasingly important to be able to catch because, as we became more and more reliant on these software systems, it's the cost of these bugs, and the potential impact of having a security hole, was really growing. So I think I was interested in it from the technical side, and then really the top use case was around doing this type of static analysis to help find these type of security holes in software. And so that's really how I got into that area. My first company, Mocha 5, this was based on a research project at Stanford called The Collective. The basic idea is that we wanted to build this next generation computing utility. This is, if you rewind back, this is probably, in the early 2000s. I was the go-to IT guy for all of my family and friends and everyone else I knew. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh, well, you're doing your PhD in computer science. Like, you can definitely fix my printer. Or
you're a computer person.
Yeah.
Like, oh,
yeah. And I myself, I was struggling with how do I manage like desktop Windows, things like that. How do I keep things patched and up to date, installing software, all of these things. Like, it was just a nightmare. And so we envisioned this idea
of like, you're saying as the IT guy for friends and family, you have 20 folks in your organization that are relying on you to patch their systems and manage everything. Basically, that's funny.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would sit down on my parents' computer. I was like, oh my God, what did you do to this thing? And I think
why do you have so many Yahoo toolbars in your Internet Explorer? You can't even see the window.
Yeah. These. And so I became the go-to IT guy. And so this is the basic idea behind that project was we wanted to make computing more like a utility. It's like you just turn it on. It's like you pick up the phone, you get dial tone, and then really make computers work a lot more like consumer electronics work. It's just, you turn it on, it just works. You don't really have to think about patching and updates and these type of things. And, the interesting thing is that a lot of ideas from that, like they were like, when you look at on the mobile landscape, like in terms of the way that the mobile ecosystem has gone, they've really taken a lot of these ideas and incorporated on the mobile side. The way we got started on that side was, trying to do this for desktop computers. We did it using virtualization, using virtual machines. I mean, like 2 doors down office was Mendel Rosenblum, who was founder of VMware. They were doing a lot of, VMs for server consolidation, these type of things. And thought, okay, hey, maybe we could use VMs to help solve desktop management. And so that was really the premise behind it. Of course, like the first time around, we made lots and lots of mistakes, like in terms of founding the company, in terms of how we approach product and all of these other things. But we eventually did find this niche, which was we were riding this wave of like bring your own device, like things like it really started with Mac and MacBook Air, and MacBook Air came out and that was the hot thing everyone wanted to use. But then in the enterprises, they're all Windows shops, right? And so, the exec would come by as like, here's a MacBook Air. I want to use a MacBook Air, right? And then the IT department would say, well, we're a Windows shop, we're a Microsoft shop. You can't use this. But they were at such a level that, they weren't asking, they were telling, right? It's like, it's like, no, I don't want to be the only sales guy in this group that doesn't have the MacBook Air. I want the MacBook Air. And so, the IT departments were then faced with that. And so that's where virtualization came in. But you also had the security angle there as well. Like in terms of, yes, well, how do you keep those things secure and everything? And so we found a niche there. We later on found a niche on the, similar thing for tablets and phones. Like this is the iPad, really iPad, iPhone, these type of things. We didn't have all of those enterprise security features, but still users wanted to use them. And so in general, like rode this trend from like bring your own device, which is now it's very commonplace. I mean, at that time we called it consumerization of IT, where it's like, took these like really consumer products. And then that was really what was driving IT and IT spend. And so through that experience there, heard a lot about from our customers, really IT departments and CISOs and and security professionals around like some of the challenges that they had and this tension between security and user experience. And heard this all the time, like because we made a product that was designed for end user use, but it was really an enterprise product. So we had to go and sell to the enterprise. Often it'd be the security team or the desktop management teams there, but end users would touch this product every single day. And so that dynamic really informed a lot of the way to think about enterprise security, and especially like the enterprise user, that enterprise end user, and what their experience was. And I have lots of great stories from that time period, like in terms of customers that we had interacted with, and just like jaw-dropping situations where just very creative ways that users would find their way around security protocol. Like one of my favorites, which is also it's related to the stuff that we're currently doing now with authentication, is so we talked with one team at an enterprise company, and they had a set of users that wanted to share an account for VPN access. So they had one account for VPN access. They had instituted mandatory 2FA, like via physical token, like one of those RSA, secure ID tokens.
Sure.
And it was just fairly common. This has probably been about 2010, 2011, around that time frame. Pretty common for VPN access. That's high risk access. It requires 2FA. But there's a group of users, they just wanted to share an account. And so what they did was they set up a webcam that pointed at the physical token, so that they could then share their account. Like whoever wanted to log in, they could go to this URL, they could see what the current code was, and they could type it in. And that was their low-tech solution to kind of getting around the challenge, the friction involved in 2FA.
Brilliant. Probably not authenticated.
No, it's just a random URL, which, I mean, it is, sure, it's more secure than having nothing, but, that was probably not what the IT department intended when they said, like, yeah, you need to use 2FA. And the interesting thing is, the realization came that you can't blame the users in these cases, because you designed, as IT, you designed a system that didn't allow the people to be productive or do what they wanted. And so, like people just find a way around it. It reminds me of, there's so many companies. There used to be a really big thing where it's like, we're going to put a box in your network, and we're going to have all this DLP, and we're going to be this man in the middle proxy, and we're going to decode all of your traffic, and we're going to figure out if people are trying to steal IP or personal information, or like these type of things, right?
Kind of the CASB space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And and then what do people do? Like they so they get these lockdown machines, and they can't even go to YouTube, or they can't even go to these other places. And so what they do is that they'll get like a 4G modem, and they just plug it into their computer. And then all of your millions of dollars that you spent securing your perimeter and all this, that all goes out the window, because you completely just bypass it by just plugging in like, a 4G modem into the
a MiFi or whatever.
Yeah, MiFi or whatever. Like there's just time and time again, these cases. Another entertaining case I remember we were working with Intel, who is very, very privacy conscious. I mean, very, very conscious around IP and around leaking of IP. And I remember being in, I think it's one of their boardrooms there, overhearing a conversation of one of the executives there. They had recently allowed iPhones. So the longest time, Intel was a holdout. Like they didn't allow people to have email on their iPhones, because they did not have all the security features of BlackBerry, and to be able to say, oh, it's encrypted. Oh, they didn't have all the security features. But there was such a demand from the employee side, from the end users, that it's like, no, we want to use iPhones. And so eventually the IT department relented and they said, okay, well, we'll allow you to have that email on the iPhone, but we're going to strip all the attachments. We'll allow the email through because the really sensitive stuff is in the attachments. We're going to strip out all the attachments. And so that's what they had implemented. And so I'd overheard this call, where he's talking to someone. He's like, oh, can you send over that presentation? Oh, wait a second. I'm on my iPhone. Can you send it to my Gmail account instead? And so, again, just completely bypassing the security protocols. And you can't blame the user in this case, because they're not trying to be malicious; they're just trying to be productive.
And so when you're at Mocha 5, did you have enterprise software chops? Like, I know you were a co-founder. Did your other co-founders, had they been in enterprise software companies, or was this the first for everyone?
No, first. It was the first for everyone. I mean, I mentioned we made a lot of mistakes through that whole experience. I mean, and we did a lot of things wrong, and I learned a lot from that experience. But yeah, none of us had any enterprise experience. And in fact, when we started the company, we weren't even thinking around enterprise. We were thinking about, okay, well, this would be a product like your cable company would do. So it's like the same way that you could call up and say, hey, I want HBO. We want to say, hey, you should be able to call up and say, hey, I want Photoshop, or hey, I want Microsoft Office. And then they would just be a box that they would give you, just like the cable box. And that would be your computer. They would back up all your data. They would keep track of everything for you on your computer. And then, you don't have to worry about installing software. So it was this was kind of before really software as a service became big. And this was, that was the world that we envisioned. And so we thought, the people who are the people who may want this. Well, clearly it's telcos and carriers and your cable company and these type of things, because that's the future. That's where the way you're going to get your computing in the future. We were very naive, in terms of trying to understand how that market worked. And so we quickly realized that although all of the carriers claimed that they didn't want to be dumb pipes, ultimately they weren't really the innovators in that space. And we kind of stumbled upon this use case in enterprise. Started with these areas, and the big impetus there was around, okay, people bring Macs, and people starting to bring Macs into the enterprise, but the enterprises didn't support Mac, but they did have security needs. And so we kind of fell backwards into enterprise and in the enterprise space.
Okay, so you're at Stanford. You decided to start this with, or were your co-founders also Stanford folks you worked with, or how did you know your co-founders?
It was basically our research group. It was at Stanford, so it was my advisor, my professor, and then my other co-founders were other people in my research group.
Okay, so you had this founding team. You're all at Stanford, and when you raised some seed money from KOSLA or A, or what was it?
Yeah, I guess it was an A. It was technically an A.
It all changed. Yeah.
It was about $3 million. So at that time,
today a normal seed at that point, a pretty solid A.
Yeah, solid A. And this was, we really had no clue. I knew Vinod. The only reason I knew Vinod Khosla was because his photo was outside my office, because he was one of the founders of Sun, and I saw him on the Midas list and things like that. I was and then he invited us to his office, and I was oh, that's pretty cool. And I go and talk with him. The next day, he basically sent a term sheet that says, oh, I want to invest in your company. And we're like, oh, what company? We don't have a company.
Oh, funny.
But, I was well, here's $3 million. Go do something cool. And I thought, wow, that is an awesome opportunity. And so I'm not going to pass that up. And so that's kind of how I got started on that side.
Okay. And so at that point, you had $3 million and you're like, what we're going to do is give cable companies the ability to deliver software into, was it supposed to be a box that sat in your house, or was it going to be something that they manage remotely?
No, this was before the kind of whole remote execution stuff was really feasible. So this was, again, it was the idea that you would not actually buy your own PC. You would just rent the PC the same way you do with a cable, you do with a cable box, things like that.
Okay.
And that's the basic idea. And then you don't worry about they would manage it for you, and they would also back it up, and they would also hold on to your data. So it would be really sticky. So you wouldn't It's like, well, now it's going to be really hard to move over because it's like, well, they're managing everything for me, and they have they keep track of my data and things like that. So that was the premise of it. Now, I mean, the interesting thing is like the PC market didn't go that direction. But if you look, that's very much how the way that the phone market went. Because if you think about, okay, well, I don't actually, often you don't buy your own phone, you're like financing it, across because I signed a 2-year contract, these type of things. They, you can call them up and, you don't really think that much about updates and downloading software. You can go to an app store and you can just decide what you want to download. Everything is kept isolated, these type of things. So that was really our vision around there. We chose the wrong platform.
Sure.
But that was the basic idea. And of course, we had grand visions at the beginning. That was really the background of how we got started there. And then, again, it was like that was not panning out, these type of organizations that would be able to provide that type of service were not really moving in that direction or interested in that. And so at that point, we had a really cool technology, which was, okay, I can run these desktop virtual machines. I can keep it was basically we have layering and other type of things. This is very similar to Docker and the way that these work, but it was for Windows and desktop management. And so we had a lot of cool technology around that side. And then we're kind of hunting around looking for, okay, what are we going to do with this? And then the Mac and the Enterprise happened, and then so that's where we really started to get traction on the enterprise side.
And then this is when you raised your Series B?
We had raised the Series B prior to that. I think by this time we were at a Series C. I mean, again, we had some missteps along the way. This was, I think, when we raised our B, the story was still like that kind of computing utility, next generation computing utility, because we raised $3 million initially. That lasted us for pretty good, maybe the first 2.5, 3 years, I believe, something like that. And then I think our B, if I remember correctly, it was around 18 million, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then that was raised on that initial premise. Now, during that time frame is where we found, actually, the real opportunity here for this type of capability is in the enterprise. And so we were riding this wave of the consumerization of IT wave.
Okay, cool. So you raise this B, and then during that B is when you sort of realize, okay, maybe the move is enterprise, and we need to take this to companies, and primarily from pool around MacBook Airs, which is amazing, as the key. If you think about predicting a platform shift, you wouldn't be like, there's going to be this really thin computer that every sales exec is going to want, and that's going to create this nightmare for IT orgs. But you have this solution. You're able to deliver it. What was the end user experience? Was it like I was running Windows on a MacBook Air, or what was the?
Yeah, exactly. So we partnered with VMware. We leveraged, on the Mac, we leveraged their VMware Fusion product. On Windows, we leveraged their Player product, and we built it in. They didn't see any of that. It was just basically, you launch it, you have your enterprise environment, you click go, it brings up either a full screen or a Windows environment that had it had Active Directory, it had all the corporate. It was basically your corporate desktop image, but baked into a virtual machine, and then wrapped up with all of these policies about yes, all the data has to be encrypted, and all the network traffic needs to go through the VPN, and you're not allowed to copy data in and out, and you could remote wipe it, and all of these type of management. Basically, we put a management interface around it because again, you're running on a personal device. I mean, who knows? That's probably the same device that your kids are using, or it may have malware on it and these type of things. So this is the type of stuff that we have to do.
You're installing popcorn time on it. That was popular.
Yeah. Yep. And so, we got used to this this problem of when we talk to an IT department and, or somebody in security, and they say, well, no, we're clearly we are secure because our policy states that, you can never use a personal device. There are no personal devices allowed on our network. And then you do a network scan and you point out all these personal devices that they had no clue about that were sitting there on their network. Or, that if you, go and survey the users and things like that, you found that, no, actually, yeah, you may have these policies, but if you look at what people are actually doing day to day, it's quite different. And so, there was this challenge and tension in terms of talking to these IT departments and these security, the people in security within enterprise around like what is actually happening within your enterprise. Because many of them, like they really had no clue about what people were actually doing. So if you come from that angle, if you then say, let's take it as a given that people are going to want to use their own devices, to access work things. Okay, how could you possibly secure that? And so that's where we started to get, okay, now we can have a conversation. Now we can have a conversation about what are the type of stuff that you can do. It's like, well, clearly we want to be able to, before the thing connects, we want to be able to make sure that, do a malware scan and make sure that it doesn't have any, known malware on it, or scan for keyloggers or like these other type of security things. And okay, obviously it's like if it's a personal device, I don't have all those controls over it. Like we want to make sure that encryption is enforced. You want to make sure that all these things are enforced. And if they're not, like I want to be able to remote wipe it, like just, that container. And so we start to have a conversation along those lines of, okay, let's talk about the way that people are actually using IT and technology within your organization. And let's talk about ways that how you can support that and not become the CI no whose job is to say no to everything. It's like, no, if you want to be like enlightened CIO, you have to talk about, technology as a business enabler, like IT as a business enabler. And so like the more enlightened, people were moving in that direction. And I think like the trend has been certainly in that direction now. So nowadays, like both with, people moving things to cloud and it's, it's no longer about, oh, I need to keep everything within my walls and keep everything secure. And security is, trumps everything else. Now you have a new generation of IT leaders who really, they see their role in a really different way.
And so, was VDI, was that a thing? Was that like a category at that time?
It was, yeah. And so that was our main competitor was VDI. So in the VDI space, this is basic idea is like you take all these desktops and you put them all on a server and you run them on a server. So they're easy to manage, because they're just virtual machines on a server. You can patch them whenever you want. You can scan them. You can do whatever you want. But every time you wanted to use one of these, you then had to use some type of remote desktop protocol to connect in. And my co-founder, her husband actually was one of the people that was originally working on this product called Sunray, which was back in the early days, this thing called Thing Clients, which is these really stripped down machines that didn't have any storage or anything that basically just allowed remote desktop and that's it. And so I very much did not subscribe to that model at all. I thought it was it's a bad user experience and it was just really silly. But that was it was just a big thing. I mean, VMware and Citrix, Microsoft and others, they sold a lot of people's servers. And the VDI, that was in terms of getting fast storage and everything in the data center people loved it because it's well, okay, look, I'll take desktops too. Let's just put that in our data center. But it was just very impractical from just a latency standpoint. I see this again, Google now has their online gaming service where it's okay, we're going to play games, but I don't have to install them. It's going to be like a remote desktop thing. I remain very skeptical about these type of things because, it makes so much sense to do things on the edge, this just in terms of latency and scale and everything, and then reliance on network. There's a lot of things that make sense to do on the edge. So our most direct competitor was VDI, and we provided an alternative that had all of the centralized management of VDI, but the execution happened on the local device. So whereas a VDI server, you could maybe get 40 users per server, or maybe 50, or if you give them a really bad experience, you could give them more users per server. For our solution, we were able to manage 50,000, 100,000 users per server because none of the computation actually happened on the server. It was just doing policies and updates was managed on the server, but all the execution happened on the endpoint device. And that also meant you could run offline. And there were just too many use cases where it's well, if the only way you could use your computer is like you need to have this high quality, low latency network connection. It's like, well, what about when you're on an airplane? Or, there's just too many cases where if you say, yeah, you cannot be productive if you don't have that high bandwidth, low latency network connection. Yeah. And so that's primarily who we competed against.
Okay. So, but there was multiple companies in the VDI space, right? So there was like, virtual desktop infrastructure was like a handful of companies, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
And were you the only sort of like company in this? I guess VMware, like to your point, sort of provided some amount of this functionality, but not any of the management layer, right? They're kind of like the underlying.
Yeah, and so that's the niche that we had and that we ended up with. And then, this was really on the laptop and the desktop side. And then we saw like the advent of iPhones and then iPads as well. And then it was a most similar type of story where people wanted to use this, but there was no, in the early days, there was not really even MDM or anything like that for those on those mobile platforms. And so that's where, in that space, we compete with good technologies or any of the Mobile Iron or any of these other MDM providers in terms of being able to provide enterprise management on these platforms.
And so you then would bring a Windows desktop experience to an iPhone 4?
No. By that time we had not. This was not like the type of stuff you do on a phone is really different. You don't want to be pinching and zooming and stuff through a Windows desktop experience. This is more around people being able to have ready access to information and the things like email, contacts, file shares. Like SharePoint or, other sensitive documents and things like that. But you don't want people just to be able to download that to their iPad or their iPhone and then go and forward it to whoever, or it's not encrypted or any of this. And so that access was stored within a secure container on that device, like on the iPad or on the iPhone.
Oh, so you delivered it like as an app?
Yes, this was delivered as an app, and then you have seamless access to like your corporate resources. Like you don't have to hook up a VPN to the whole device. You just had the VPN was baked
single
into
app.
Single app. Yeah. So you download this app, you then register. You can then the enterprise can say, okay, here's the resources, here's the intranet sites that they want them to be able to access, the internal web resources. Here's a single sign-on capability, so I don't have to sign on to every single thing. Here's like, documents, shares, SharePoint, like these type of things. And then again, you can set all sorts of policies about, okay, do they need to authenticate? Are they allowed to print? Are they allowed to open data and copy data into other apps? These type of things.
Interesting. Okay. Where did it go from there? You raised money, you got this out there.
Yeah.
MacBook Airs are all over the place. Then what's the sort of next chapter?
This was very much an enterprise company. We had a very kind of typical inside sales process there where, we had very long sales cycles, especially, if you think about some of the things we're doing is the desktop replacement. There are companies that were saying, we want to move for this model of, the company owns the laptops and you'll get a company provision laptop and we'll refresh those every 3 or 4 years. And they wanted to move to using a personal device, especially for things like contractors or people working from home or in certain industries, oil and gas was big in the legal space and places where there was certain regulations. And that's where you had the biggest uptick, the biggest interest, in terms of those type of verticals. But it was very, we had our enterprise sales team. The sales cycles enterprise sales cycles are already long. These are even longer because they're often tied to a hardware refresh. And so even if we get somebody excited in terms of the rollout, it's like, well, okay, as we start, we're not going to take people and move them off from their current laptop onto this. It's like when their laptop ages out, instead of replacing it with, another Windows laptop, it's like, oh, you'll get the option of choosing a Mac. And, there's a lot of different models. They had even BYOD where it's like the people would even just get the device and own it. There was also CYOD, which is they could choose their own device. They had a menu of stuff. So it was still owned by the company, but you now have the option to choose a Mac or, other types of hardware as well. So but many of the things that we're doing, because they were tied with the hardware refresh cycles, these things were really, really long and it was very lumpy. It was very, it's like hunting elephants. You go and we would be able to deal these big deals, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars deals, but they took a long, long time to close and even longer time to deploy. And so it was there was a lot of ups and downs where it was like, well, whether we're going to make this quarter or not is going to depend on whether this PO comes in, on March 30th or April 1st. And we continuously had a lot of challenges along those lines. And I think this is true of any enterprise company, any company that is selling into the enterprise, but it was especially true at Mocha because of the nature of what we're doing. We were often tied to hardware refresh cycles, which would stretch out things even further.
Cool. And so it sounds like maybe it wasn't growing as fast as you wanted it to grow. And so what sort of was the conclusion there?
So eventually, like I mentioned, we had like a number of missteps. We had gone through 4 CEOs, I believe, and this was like coming up to close to 10 years. And we had some cool technology. We had like earlier on in the company, we had some very strong interest around like potential acquisition and these type of things. Again, like the board was not interested in that. Like they were very interested in like they wanted the big outcome, right?
Sure.
They didn't want the the 2x or 3x return. They wanted the 50x, 100x return. So I believe I'll have to look back. I think it was maybe like from start to finish. I think we raised around $83 million. From like through the course of the company. I'm not sure what series we ended up with, but like again, there was we had raised quite a bit of money by that point in time, and then basically what had happened like towards the end was like we had some very strong interest. Some things happened like on my personal life, on my personal side, where I was not able to work after that point, and then the rest of the exec team at that point was like, well, okay, like they were out as well. And so then it was largely like a fire sale at that point. It was not, I mean, it did eventually get picked up and acquired, but it was not the outcome that any of us had been wanting,
Sure.
Especially thinking around 10 years in.
Yeah.
And so, and a lot of this you can, learned a ton of lessons through that whole experience, which are very valuable in the next company. And we approach things in a very different way at UnifyID, and it's definitely paid off.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's a great time to kind of talk about, what is UnifyID like, and what's the backstory, and then let's dive into that a little bit as well.
Yeah. So UnifyID. So we do something called implicit authentication. We can authenticate users based on passive factors, things that about their behavior or about their environment that are unique to them, but don't require any conscious user action. They can just be themselves, and there's enough that's unique about them that we can actually use that for authentication in many cases. And so this was really driven by, again, like experience at Mocha 5 and seeing all of these cases where if you try to implement security without taking the end user experience into account, then you're going to run into all sorts of problems. It either won't be adopted or even worse, people will use it and be miserable, right? And this was especially true around authentication technologies. You look at things like, there's passwords, and then like the predominant method at that point was we have passwords and we have these password complexity rules. And we also have rules around, you have to change your password every so often, and you're not allowed to reuse old passwords. And there's just a lot of frustration on that side, especially because people are now getting used to interacting with more and more services. And so now they have to like manage more and more passwords. So there was that. There was also like the view that passwords are not a great solution in the first place. I mean, the whole notion of the password is I have a secret and I tell you that secret, and that's how you know that it's me. And of course, that leaves it open to things like phishing. Like if they can somehow trick you into entering your password in the wrong place, I can figure out what it is, or key logging or screen scraping or like those type of attacks. It also opens yourself up to, I'll reuse the same passwords on multiple services. And then now if one of them gets breached, then I may not even know about it, but it still get compromised on that point, right? So passwords alone were clearly that this was not scaling, and it was not working. And then, but the existing 2FA solutions were not very good. I mean, you look at things like the physical tokens, like a RSA security, which admittedly add a lot of security and a very secure solution. this notion that I have to carry something extra around and then I have to type in this code before it expires, things like that. This was not, if you look at the actual adoption of 2FA, of that style of 2FA is very, very low. And, people hated it. Like they did not want to use it. So in some cases there was mandated, you must use it. And so people just, they dealt with it, but nobody liked it. And then you looked at other, because those things were so inconvenient, those physical tokens, they then moved to soft tokens, which is basically an app on your phone that like holds a secret. And then it's much the same thing. You can then type in your code, based on your app. And then that was a realization that, okay, well, people don't want to carry something extra around. So I'm going to just do this I'm going to make a soft token, a software version of the token, and do that just on the phone. Like the security is quite a bit lower in these cases, especially, if your phone is jailbroken or any of these, like there's not really great ways to keep those things secure. And so you do lose some of the security there, but the convenience ends up trumping that. But then this is silly. Like if you just think about this idea of, I have my phone in my hand and it's, displaying a code and I'm sitting at my computer. And then for some reason I need to type in that code onto my keyboard when the two devices are sitting right next to each other. Like you're just introducing friction. Like things should not work this way. And so with this realization, at Mocha 5, one of our big customers was Royal Dutch Shell, and they were very forward thinking. They were thinking around authentication and how to deal with identity. And they have a huge, massive organization. I think they were Global One, or like at the time they were basically the largest company in the world for some period of time there. And they had a system where everyone used smart cards and pins. Like nobody knew what their password was. They didn't use passwords. They used a smart card and a pin. If you wanted to authenticate, you plug in your smart card, you type in your pin, which is actually a very good solution from the security standpoint. But then they ran into very practical matters of, well, okay, I want to authenticate on my phone, but I can't plug my smart card into my phone. Like, what am I going to do? And so, all of this, it's in this environment that we started to come from the other direction. It's like, well, how far could you go if you don't require the user to do anything? Because that's the hard part of security, is actually changing human behavior. And so that's the approach that we took. So we had talked about VDI, and me and my co-founder, we went to a security conference where we did this demo, which was basically as an attack against VDI, where what we did is we built this tool that took a Wireshark trace of the network traffic between the client and the server for VMware and Citrix and Microsoft, and a set of these type of remote desktop like VDI solutions. And of course, they encrypted all the traffic, which is nice, but we didn't look at the content of the packet. We just look at the timing between the packets. And then based on that, we could determine the timing of the user's keystrokes on their terminal. And then based on that, we could actually determine what the user was typing. Because you can think as you're moving your fingers around the keyboard, there's slightly different timings depending on like which keys you're touching. And if you combine that with a language model, you can actually build something that can predict like what somebody is typing. And so we had this awesome demo where you type something across this encrypted channel, you drop this Wireshark trace in this tool, and it would say, here's what I thought you typed. And people were really blown away by this because they had been sold, this VDI solution says everything is secure, it's all in your data center. But like little do they know that this was, they just opened themselves up to this side channel attack. And then, that where you could pick up keystroke timings and then figure out what people are typing. And so that's really how we got started on this technology. This was kind of a connection back to Stanford in my PhD days. There was Dan Benet, who's a professor there at Stanford. He had done a lot of work in these type of side channel attacks and these type of things, very aware of that work. There was another person there when I was doing my PhD that was looking at something called keystroke dynamics, that was, looking at how somebody types and then using that for identity and identity verification, authentication. And so we begin to explore things in these areas just kind of as a side project. It turns out
because you were back at Stanford teaching at that point, or what was that?
I was teaching at that point, but this was, if you think about the kind of the evolution of the company at Mocha 5, so I was a CTO, and like initially there was a lot of technology work. In the later stages of the company, it was much more about, okay, sales execution, getting people deployed, these type of things. There's less of that kind of core technology work. And so I was still involved there, but this is why also I went back to Stanford and start to teach. And then I was, start to do some side projects there as well. And so this was one of the side projects that, initially it started as a demo that we had put together for, as a demo of attack on VDI. But then, one of the challenges that we had in that was actually it would work really well for me because it was like the system was trained on me. But like if somebody else tried it, it would not work as well because they typed in a different way. And so, it was kind of in this that type of environment. That's where the idea and the genesis of that was born. And so we began to look at these, things like keystrokes. What we found is you type around 3 sentences, we could then tell pretty accurately whether it's you or not. Like once you've typed around 3 sentences, we looked at trackpad usage. It turns out like the way that people scroll on their trackpad is really unique to them. Like, in terms of what part of the trackpad they're touching, what is the arc and the angle and the pressure they're using, things like that. And so there's a lot of promising things there. And then we looked on the phone because we saw like a big opportunity on the phone. And like there's a wealth of sensors on the phone, and that's really what unlocked it in terms of using that sensor data from the phone. Things like the accelerometer and gyroscope, and your location and these other factors. And each of them individually, they had their own false positives. You didn't always get signal from them, but if you combined a large number of these together, then you could get something that was very highly accurate. And so that's really how we got started at UnifyID.
Okay, interesting. So again, had university roots and sort of from some work and things you were doing at the university, right?
Yeah, that's right.
In terms of commercializing any of these projects that come out of a university, is there like anything special you're doing or working with the university on, or is it all sort of like Stanford is great about just letting these technologies come out and become companies?
No. So when I was at Stanford as a PhD student, like I was doing research under Stanford, under these grants. When I went back and became a lecturer, I was just like, I was basically a hired gun where they needed somebody to teach some of the classes. And so I had background in that area. And so this was like the compilers class. I went back to teach the compilers class because that was really my research area. And then, the interesting thing is like the way that they do it is like, you're there literally as a hired gun. Like you're there, I'm employed for the quarter. And then as the quarter finishes, then like I'm no longer employed. And then the next year they employ me again. And then I'm no longer employed. So there's, I think my title was visiting lecturer. And so I was not really the full-time employee of the university at that point, but I still had many of these connections there and talked with many of the people, including Dan Bonet, for example. He was an advisor at our first company, Mocha 5. He's also an advisor here at UnifyID as well. And so I was aware of those things and worked on them. But like in the case of like the stuff we're doing at UnifyID, that was very much a separate side project that we were working on that was informed by those things. But back to your original question around for Mocha 5, for example, or anything that comes out of university, there's a technology licensing office because any work that you do at Stanford, like using Stanford resources, it's owned by Stanford. Like because they're paying. They pay for those graduate student stipends. They pay. They're providing those resources. So, and there's a technology licensing office, and this is true at Stanford and Berkeley, at MIT, and just about every other school. Where if you want to build a company based on something in a university, you have to interact with that technology licensing office. And so the way the model typically works is, obviously, like Stanford and others, like they want these things to get out in the world and they want to become something big. You think about things like Google, for example, which is based on research at Stanford, and then they spun it off into a company, and a big company. And so usually the way that they'll do it is they say, well, okay, we'll negotiate, we'll give you an exclusive license to the IP that you developed here. And in exchange for that, we'll get some equity in your company, and there'll be some set of like escalating payments that'll happen. Like initially it's going to be really cheap. Maybe it's like you pay $1,000 for your exclusive license to all of this tech. But then that kind of that will start to ramp up over time. And so that's the way that they'll typically set up these type of deals, because they want it to be a win-win. I mean, they want people to go off and spin off companies based on this research, but they want to have a piece of that as well. And so I think Stanford's done this very successfully, and they have a very good technology licensing office that negotiates these type of deals, and so that the university can see the upside there as well. And so then often, they'll get equity. Like the university will get equity in your startup, in the company, and then in exchange for an exclusive license. Now, if you don't care about the exclusive license, then they are welcome to go and take that technology and then license it to whomever. But of course, like they would much rather license it to somebody who was the one who did the work, who's most likely, to succeed with it. And that will typically be the people who are initially involved.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So there's also other technologies that anyone can try to go license.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, so if you have something, if they have something that's commercially viable, that was developed, as part of university, then that's part of the job of the technology licensing office, is to monetize that in appropriate ways. And so part of that is in terms of, talking with various companies. And then this is most common when you have some concrete artifact that, like a patent, for example. If you filed a patent, like based on some of the work you've done at Stanford, then Stanford will then license that patent, so you can have those IP protections. The other very common thing is code. So if you're working on something that's a research project within a university setting and you want to spin that off into a company, you can't go and just take that code and start a company, because that code, like that IP, is actually owned by the university. And so you have to work out a deal to license that, even if you're not using that much of the code or anything like that. Like, many times that's like the first initial version is like the version that you built like at the university using university resources. And then so that, in these cases, they, you do need to license that code from the technology licensing office.
Oh, interesting. And so a lot of that code that's happening there actually isn't open source. It's like,
well, it can be open source, but then if you want to,
it has the license on it. The open source license isn't like Apache 2 or something.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a case where, okay, if you want to like have proprietary access to that code, I mean, that is one way that people do it, is like you have a university project, you make that open source, then you can go out into industry and then you can use that the same as anyone else could use that, and that's fine. But if you have started to build proprietary code that you don't want to be open source, or these type of techniques and stuff that were not open source, and you want to maintain them to not be open source, then you need to license that from the university. And I think this is also, in particular, this is not a little bit different for like undergrads, for example. Like, if you're an undergrad in a university, you're not getting support from the university in terms of like a research grant or these type of things. The rules are a little bit different in those type of cases versus like if you're a grad student and, they are paying you as a research assistant, or those type of things. And like when you're doing that, ostensibly like that IP that you generate is owned by the university in those cases. And so, and again, like they're not evil people, like they want this stuff to get out. And so they want to facilitate that. And so they're not going to be difficult in terms of being, they strive to be really easy to work with and actually encourage people to go out and start companies. But most commonly, they'll take some slice of equity based on that, and then in exchange for that, you get the exclusive license.
Oh, interesting. And any range of equity they take? Is it like 5%, 2%? What's the?
I think it really, really varies. I mean, I think this is, again, they don't want to have a situation where they are holding your company back in any way. So this is like in the kind of single digit percentages is the most typical, I think.
Cool.
It's 1 or 2% or like these type of things. And then, which, I mean, I think that, again, they want to be easy to work with, but they do want to be able to see some of the upside if one of these things, like Google or others, like go and become really successful.
Yeah. That's cool. I don't know much about that world. So that's pretty interesting. Okay. So back to UnifyID. So you kind of built this little hack to basically prove that VDI is insecure, probably because you're still fighting that war, and then you realize it has some additional, like that hack has some interesting implications. Is that sort of what happened next?
That's right. Yeah. And then began to think, just again, it's like this side project that that was working on, just looking at, okay, what are the other sources of
these like signals that you have?
That's precisely right. Yeah. And so look at these other signals and then, put together some, machine learning was becoming a thing again at that point. This is around 2014, 2015 timeframe. Like I had some background in that. Like I had one chapter of my thesis was had something around machine learning. And then when I was there at Stanford, I'd taken a class with Andrew Ng, and then he had consulted with me a little bit on some papers and stuff I was writing. So I was familiar with these techniques, and then and applied some of these techniques to this problem, and then found, actually there's you can go a long way in terms of being able to identify and authenticate the user, like the human being, without requiring them to do any conscious action. And so when we thought about like what is the shape of the solution in the future, we knew it was not going to be passwords. We knew that it's not going to be something extra that you have to carry around. And honestly, anything that required the user to change their behavior would be a very hard sell. Like it would be, that's the hardest part of security, is actually changing human behavior. So, if we thought about what is the shape of the solution in the future, we thought, okay, well, it's going to be passive. It's going to be continuous. It's going to be something that users ideally would not have to even think about and do. And it'd be much more natural. It'd just be much more natural interactions, the same way that you or I would talk. It's like, how do I know that that you are actually Grant Miller? Well, it's like, well, we met before and I recognize your voice. And like, that's how I know that you are who you say you are. And, we thought that technology, in terms of authentication technology, was going to move in the same direction, where many of these interactions, which, it's like, okay, I have this physical key, token that I need to plug in, or I need to type in this code for, or I need to remember this password, or these security questions, or these type of things. Like you thought, like many in the future, it's going to be much more like you'd see in the kind of like some sci-fi movies, things like that, where it's like you're going to have a voice interface. You're going to these type of things are going to be much more natural and just much more continuous, and just happening all the time. And so that's the model like that we knew like things are going to move that way in the future. And so that's just really how we started building the technology around that side.
Cool. And then I think you maybe launched it at RSA or something?
Yeah, so we were in stealth for a long time. We actually launched at TechCrunch Disrupt, like on stage.
Nice.
Yeah, this was in San Francisco, where we honestly, at that point, we had no clue what people were going to think of this, because we think, are people going to be creeped out by this? Are they going to think this is Big Brother? How are people going to react? And we had a really surprisingly positive reaction. There was probably like 5% or so that was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And, what about privacy and like these type of things? But we had 95% of the people were, so you're telling me that you're going to track everything I do. You're going to track my location and my movement, all of this. And I don't need to remember passwords. Sign me up, because that's the world that I want to live in. And because there was so much frustration around that, things on that problem, on that side. Also, I think attitudes around these things have really evolved. I mean, if you think about Amazon Echo, like Alexa, right? And so let's say in 2005, you had said, you're going to have a microphone in your house so that Amazon can listen to everything you say, so you could, talk to Amazon and order toilet paper, or, ask what the weather is or whatever. And they'll be listening all the time. And like, that is like literally straight out of 1984. That is like, people would think you were crazy. And now that's one of the top selling products on Amazon. And again, it's because people see the value in it, and their attitudes around these things are evolving. And so, I think that people care about privacy and they care about security, but they also care about convenience. And if you can provide, some amount of extra convenience or value to the end user, then people are often willing to share more information or to, use these type of systems. The other thing that had happened, I think, is that technology and machine learning had reached a point where things that used to be sci-fi were now actually people see these in real life. I mean, stuff like, an autonomous vehicle, like a self-driving car. And so like the fact that a car can drive itself, I mean, and people were accepting of, of that type of technology, or understand like that type of technology existed. Like, when we came along and then say, yeah, we can identify you based on your gait and based on like the way you operate, you touch your screen and things like that. This was not, so far-fetched that people actually believed it, and they believed it was possible. And so that was certainly a contributing factor. The other aspect was around the security problem. The fact the security problem had gotten so bad, passwords, people hate passwords so much, and all of those, the security questions and 2FA and everything. I think there was a general understanding and consensus that this was not the way of the future. Like, this was not the way that things were going to be in the future. There was a question mark in people's minds about, okay, what is it? Like, what is it going to be? How am I going to do identity and authentication in the future? But it was clearly like not going to be passwords or passwords plus 2FA codes or, these type of things. And so there was definitely an appetite for this type of approach.
So, there's a couple different ways that you could take that to market, though, right? So you could try to take this to companies so they can replace their passwords for their consumer service with this new way to identify consumers, right? Mm-hmm. Or you can take it to companies and say like, hey, stop handing out, RSA tokens and start using more of this context to help people, authenticate into your corporate network. Which approach did you decide to take?
Well, I mean, again, like we went through multiple iterations of this. When we first got started, I mentioned like we were at TechCrunch Disrupt. We had RSA Innovation Sandbox, and I think we're the first ever and still only ever unanimous winner there, and then South by Southwest and like a handful of others as well. Like, our initial approach though was basically as like a souped up password manager. So like, we had a Chrome extension, we had a browser extension, and a mobile app that individuals could go and like they could download. We had a beta, like a private beta that people sign up for, and then we basically manage all their passwords and credentials, but we just hide all of that stuff. So like, you go to a website, you go to Amazon, whatever, like it wouldn't even show you or ask you for your password. It would just be usually replace this by this button that just like log in using UnifyID. You'd click that, and then in the background, it would actually be talking username and password with a backend, but we had to kind of wrap our authentication technology around that. Now, that approach is very hard because we needed a lot of data to improve our technology and to really drive that machine learning algorithms. And it's a hard slog, like in terms of user growth on the consumer side, like sort of like, yeah, maybe you can get, we had a big splash at TechCrunch. We got 10,000 people to sign up and download our app and all of this. But then, in terms of, you want to talk about growth there, and, it's like we needed millions of users to be able to get the type of data that we needed. And, we look at that growth path as like, well, you got to fight tooth and nail just to get to get 10,000. And then, the next week, if you need to double that, then you need to do all of that work plus more. And again, like, end users don't care that much about security. It was like a little bit of a hard slog. You look at like, people like LastPass, 1Password, and others as well. They'd been at it for a long time, still did not have great penetration. Like the number of people who use password managers was not very high. There's also not the market that we wanted to be associated with in any case. And so we then shifted, and it was really, I was like, oh, well, how can we get more users and more data? It's like, oh, well, then again, it was like, we started to get approached by organizations that had challenges around this, and they already had millions of users. They already had millions of end users. So we can give you an SDK, you can link into your app, and then we can scale up much more quickly. And so that's really what our approach was this time. We bootstrapped a bit with those kind of beta users, just individuals with our Chrome extension and our mobile app. And then we quickly moved to an SDK that you can link into other apps and then provide that service. And then again, like we had a choice, is like, do we want to go after within the enterprise, like, trying to displace, existing authentication mechanisms within a company? Or do we want to go more of a B2B2C route where we are authenticating, our customers' ultimate end users? And so we did the latter. So like we focus on the latter. So we made that SDK so that, for example, we work with, a bank or, and integrate into their banking app. And so then, providing extra levels of authentication for their ultimate end users. And the thing that really drove us there was, Number one was our need for data. And so if we, even if we have a large deployment within an enterprise, I mean, that's like 100,000 people, at most. I mean, like even large enterprises, they're like, on the order of hundreds of thousands of people. Whereas, I mean, if you talk to, other services, then that goes into the millions and tens of millions. And so that's one direction. And this aligns with like the long-term strategic direction of the company, in terms of we're trying to build this next generation identity platform that's not based on passwords, but based on these other behavioral factors, and then get like a large enough portion of the population onto that platform. And so this is, there was a route like within the enterprise. The other thing is there are established players there with very aggressive sales forces that, that were executing extremely well. I mean, I'll point to Duo, for example. I mean, Duo, they got acquired for $3+ billion. They didn't really have that much technology. They basically had they had an app, and they had like, something that was slightly better than, RSA, and that RSA security and soft token, but there was no real technology like there. But they executed extremely well on the enterprise sales side, and they got a lot of great deals, and they ate a lot of market share from RSA. They like do greenfield opportunities of people wanting to saying like passwords are not secure, you need to do 2FA, and then they were there. They had the just the right solution and positioned in the right way. And so us as a tiny startup at this point, we're 10 people. It's like that was not the market that we wanted to go and compete against, because I knew what that market would look like. That would be big inside sales team, kind of trying to land these type of accounts for internal usage, and then really going head to head against it was not just Duo. There's a whole set of that companies that really go after that space, and so that was another reason why we shied away from doing that kind of within the enterprise, authenticating employees and contractors.
Got it. Okay, so then doing the B2B2C side, was the idea that end customers opt into this, or that it's more like a fraud prevention kind of technology?
So this is really the two biggest areas of our business. I mean, one is around streamlining authentication. And so that is like eliminating passwords, like going passwordless, because, both from the user experience point of view, as well as the security point of view, there's a lot of organizations that want to move to passwordless, but they're not sure how to get there. And so then we provide a very nice solution, either for passwordless or for, displacing kind of existing 2FA. So it's a supplement to the password. So you still have your password, but instead of doing like I type in the 6-digit code or I SMS and text you this code, then we're able to do this in a much more seamless way. And so in these cases, we most often work with product owners and ones that they care a lot about user experience. They want to kind of move to that next generation experience. Another one is call centers or contact centers. Cases where there's a lot of friction involved in the authentication process, as well as it being a vector for attack, and then so providing more seamless authentication in those type of contexts, as well as physical world, like things like for smart locks and doors and automobiles like cars, travel, like these type of things as well. And so that's one area. The other area is really around working closely with the risk and fraud teams. And so in these cases, this is more like they're already ingesting a lot of different signals, around risk and fraud. What devices is coming from, what is the IP address, what are the previous purchases this account has made, what is the velocity on this account, like in a more general sense, like in terms of correlating with other providers, like have I seen somebody with this identity trying to open up accounts at 10 different organizations? Okay, that's now risky. Or has these credentials been part of a data breach? Or like using a lot of these different signals, and then we just provide additional signals, additional context, and we provide a lot of value there, because like the type of things that we look at are really different and orthogonal to many of the other aspects that they look at, and so they find a lot of value, not only in terms of finding new cases of fraud, but also in terms of reducing false positive rates, where it's actually legitimately users, and maybe is legitimately the correct user, but it may be like, there may be other things that flag that make it look like a risky transaction, but we're going to say, no, actually, this was the correct person because of all this, these biometrics match and everything like that. So in those cases, then we work much more closely with those teams. And then instead of just being an authentication result that's like yes or no or inconclusive, then we provide a lot more color around what was actually happening and the user was doing. And so in those cases, that's more like, in the risk and frauds case, then it's more like this is kind of just sitting in the background looking at behavior and then providing those additional signals. And then the type of stuff that we do that typically already fits in with the end user agreements that they already have in place, because they're often using things like IP address and location and other types of data for these type of things as well.
So right now you're going to market with both use cases or primarily with one or the other?
We do have some on the risk and fraud side. Most of our business is actually on the streamlining authentication side. Okay. And so going back to with the company, we started with a grand vision, and this is the way that we're gonna reinvent authentication for everyone, all these different use cases, and then we had a very cool technology. We have our gate analysis is very sophisticated. If you walk, for even a short distance, we can identify you with the same accuracy as a physical fingerprint. So about a 1 in 50,000 false positive rate. That's where the state of the technology is for gate today with our solution.
And that's just by having a phone in your pocket and walking with it for
that's right.
30 steps, or how many steps?
Yeah. Not many steps, around 5 to 10 seconds. And then we then have enough it turns out your movement and your gait is unique enough that we're able to then hit that level of accuracy. And this is all proven out with lots of real world data. We had, I believe, the latest number, 35 million devices that have run our SDK that we've collected this type of motion data for, and then we've used that to train machine learning models and validate them. So this is all this is based on real world usage as well. But that is there are sets of customers that are really the early adopters that are very interested in that area. But then, part of the struggle that we have is we don't want to just be working with innovation teams and the kind of people on the future products. We want to have people deploy, and solve problems for them immediately and burning problems. So we also basically we introduced what we view as a stepping stone to that kind of eventual future where, there's no more passwords and all this authentication happens in a much more seamless way. And we had implemented a push to auth capability. So this is basically, when you want to perform some action, you want to log into a website, for example, instead of asking for your password, or in addition to asking your password, you get a notification on your phone that says, hey, okay, somebody's trying to log in, or somebody is trying to perform this action. Do I want to approve it, or is saying that's not me? And so then we have a mechanism within there to, so we designed it with an eye towards security in terms of doing this in a much more secure way than these type of OTP, solutions, or, the SMS or the these type of solutions, which are that's the current status quo, is that most people implement SMS. SMS is not an authentication protocol. I mean, and NIST and the FBI and everyone has come out and said, this is deprecated. Do not use SMS for two-factor authentication because of lots of problems around the protocol itself. The SS7 and the communication protocol there it's not authenticated. It's not secure. It's not encrypted at all. And not only that, but then there's a big problem with SIM porting, where all you need to do is you just need to convince Verizon or AT&T or whoever it is that, I lost my phone. Can you port my number to this new SIM or this new device? Or even hey, I was a Verizon customer, now I want to be an AT&T customer. Can you port my number over? And the things that they use to authenticate these transactions is very weak. I mean, they ask you things like, what's your address? What's your brother's maiden name, or what's your social security number? All of these things that are really very easy to social engineer and to hack. And so this even happened pretty recently. There was Jack Dorsey, who is the CEO of Twitter.
Right.
He got his Twitter account taken over because somebody went into the store with a fake ID that said Jack Dorsey and ported his number to a new phone, and then reset his credentials, and then logged in as him, and then tweeted a bunch of stuff. So like in that, look, if this can happen to Jack Dorsey, it can really happen to anyone, and it does. I mean, like, this is what we hear from customers is they are now experiencing wide scale attacks on SMS as a second factor. I mean, like the most typical is like, you'll get a phone call that appears to be from your bank. You answer it and they say, "Oh, hello, I'm from, the so-and-so bank fraud department. We've noticed some suspicious activity in your account, but first we need to verify your identity. I just sent you a 6-digit code. Can you read it off to me?" And of course, like, the person reads off the code, and then, maybe the hacker will then log into using that code to reset the credentials, log into the account. They can then read off legitimate transactions. So at that point, if you had any skepticism before, you're no longer skeptical because, like, well, how could they have possibly known I did these transactions unless they actually work at the bank, right? And then, then they'll say something like, "Oh, well, like, we've noticed this fraud on your account. We need to close out your account and then set up a new one. And so, but we'll take care of all of that for you. But we'll need to transfer all the money in your account over to the new account and stuff." And say, "Oh, okay, thank you very much." And then of course later on, if you get some notification that says, "Oh, like, big withdrawal, like money being transferred," and you're like, "Oh, of course. I mean, yeah, they called and they told me like that was going to happen, right?" And so these used to be sophisticated attacks. No longer. I mean, now, like, to spoof a caller ID, like, anyone can go to any number of services, and that part is trivial. And the rest of it is just, it's just a little bit of social engineering. These are really costly attacks. And so again, it's because that SMS protocol and like using a phone number as authentication is just really fundamentally broken. And so this is, I mean, if people don't take anything else from this podcast, just take one thing, which is do not use SMS for two-factor auth. I know that there's a lot of organizations that currently use it. It is being deprecated, and it wasn't best practice 3 years ago. It's still, especially now, not best practice. And so if you're on it, like, take a serious look at moving off. If you're implementing something new, do not implement SMS because that protocol and technique is just fundamentally broken. So just related to that, we introduced a push to auth service that, like, if you log in, then you'll get a notification and you'll get all the context around it. It's much more secure. It's a much better user experience, and it's much cheaper. Like, we price it very competitively compared to SMS. And so that's actually where we're seeing a lot of uptake now, partially because, like, we're riding this wave of, okay, people want to do 2FA, but they don't want to implement SMS because, like, they know it's insecure and people don't. If you're going to do an implementation, you don't want to do the thing that is deprecated. You don't want to do something newer. And then, this really competes directly with Duo and with a number of other of these type of, like, push to authenticate solutions. And then we end up differentiating in terms of, well, we have all the behavioral pieces on top of that as well. So even if they're not ready at this point to fully embrace like a full behavioral authentication, they at the very least can just get started with like a much better, something that is much more secure, a better user experience, and much cheaper than SMS. And so that was a relatively recent shift for our company. And then and we're seeing a lot of uptake on that side.
Oh, interesting. So this is actually like an interesting lesson, which is like, oftentimes the market is not ready for your like grand future vision of the world, right? And like they're just not going to adopt it nearly as fast. And so having a product or a go-to-market solution that's sort of like the interim step before you get to there, but it's going to like people can sort of lead down the path and eventually like, okay, like this other data, like we've been doing that for years. Like now you can bring that all in as well.
Yeah. And I think this is, and just in general, any case where we develop something with, this is a new capability. It's like it's something that people don't really go and search for, this kind of, behavioral biometric authentication, things like that, because they don't even know it exists. I mean, the whole idea of like, I can authenticate based on motion and gait and like location of these type of things. Like we as a tiny startup, we could either go and educate the whole world on this and like try to push everyone in this direction. We strongly believe like things are going to move in that. And like the people that we do engage with, like, we can talk passionately about it. We can try to get them to see the world in the same way. But, again, it was like there's a lot of challenges in following that type of approach. And I think it's important to, when you do engage with a customer, engage with a vendor, they do know like there is that long-term vision and they believe in it and all of this. But, it also introduced a lot of risk. It introduced a lot of complexity. I mean, so then, if you think about what is the sales process for us, like if we're selling this behavioral biometric solution, it was like, well, first of all, they have to believe that it works. Right. Okay. This is not, and because it's not widely deployed and everything, you have to get over that skepticism. And then you have to say, okay, what about GDPR and CCPA and privacy? And then we have good answers for each of these. It's like, all the raw data stays on the local device. And like, we don't collect any PII and like all of this, we have answers to all of those. But again, it's like, this is making the sale much more complex, right? And then not to mention that even in the first place, it's not like many organizations have this. We have a budgeted project to go and do behavioral authentication. There are some. There are like the future-looking ones, the ones that are, really want to be on the cutting edge. They do. And so we engage with those customers. But if you're talking about not the early adopters, but the bulk of the market, that's an area where you have to build a solution that is really brain dead simple. The value prop is blatantly obvious, like it's smack you in the face, like it's so obvious. They already are spending money on it, or like they already have a project to do it. Like you don't have to go and convince them to create a new project or new budget for this. It already fits in with something that they're already going to do. And yes, there's competitors in that space, but like maybe the competitors are not servicing it well enough, or there's some angle that you can take, in terms of, yes, this is much more secure and it's better user experience and it's much cheaper. And then so you want to make it as easy as possible for a company to do business with you. And so it's very much along those lines, and like you can maintain that grand vision and like that product differentiation and everything, but you need to have an offering that is very, very easy for customers to adopt and use.
Yeah. I mean, part of it's like part of the demo is the wow, right? So if you can do the same stuff that somebody else is doing, but you add this wow factor in, that people are like, wow, that's really amazing. Even if they don't end up using it right away, or it's like, it becomes, if it gets the demo exciting, like it makes them want to watch and get more people involved, it can be really helpful in terms of how you sell.
Yeah. Yeah. You run into challenges there as well, though. I mean, in terms of like, well, okay, you have your website and you have other materials. So like, how much do you talk about the big vision of like where this thing is going and like, and like the capabilities, and how much do you talk about, okay, here's the things that you do that you can do with this today and like you can deploy today. And so there's a natural tension there, and you have to strike this balance very carefully.
Yeah. And sort of the way that I've been thinking about this personally for Replicated is I try to we can kind of came up with this philosophy that like, our website really needs to be directed at the buyer, so the people that are going to buy from us. And I think we have other sites, right? So we have EnterpriseReady. We're publishing a new thing pretty soon called onprem.org. And these are like the higher level, more strategic messages, right? So kind of publish your strategic messages on these content-oriented guides. And really, they're less branded about your company. And I think they're more viral and consumable that way as well. But you're really helping to deliver a vision that you believe in, but it's not really that commercial of a message. It's like, hey, we believe that this stuff is important. Mm-hmm. And then you have, your website talking to your buyer, and that's more actionable. And then I think you have to have, for us, we really try to work with developers and give them the power to like leverage our tools and adopt our tools. And so, there's open source websites and open source repos that are really kind of developer first. So it's really, to me, it's about, these different properties speaking to different audiences, and then helping that to lead to, eventually a buy, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. That's absolutely correct. And you really have to understand your customer and what is their problem. Like, who are you talking to and what do they care about, right? And in some cases, is this like the early adopter, CIO who just recently joined the company, wants to have like a major initiative, is trying to push forward a major initiative that is like really visionary and moving forward. And then you want to kind of ride along with them them and provide them all the ammunition and everything that they need. Is this somebody that like there's a fire that they have to put out, or they're like currently getting poked in the eye by something, and you're selling them something that to solve their immediate problem, and that's the thing that they care about. So you really have to understand like who is the buyer within the organization and what do they care about, and then you want to make sure that your message is very crafted towards that individual.
Yeah, I mean, product marketing is hard, right? In the enterprise software space and the security ecosystem particularly, there's just so much sort of like jargon and noise that it's hard to really differentiate and be clear about what you're doing, because you're trying to tie to categories they're familiar with and trying to, align with budget, but at the same time, you want to communicate the unique value you're bringing. So,
yeah, these are all the challenges of enterprise sales, and I think it's gotten worse. Actually, I mean, it used to be that you could do SDR work and you could reach out to someone, and then you would sometimes get a response, and people would be interested in this. Now, because like those channels have been so flooded, and now, I mean, like. Basically, like you talk to modern CIOs and others in IT in the enterprise, and there's so much there that it's just become all noise, and they just block all of it. And so you have to be really creative about how do you find and reach those people, because I mean they're getting phone calls and emails and LinkedIn and so many things, like just all the time, just inundated with all of this, because it's very lucrative. Because I mean, like, look, if you think about all these, these SDRs that are like working in all of these organizations, and if they get that deal, if that customer signs, that can make or break a company, that can make their quarter, like all of this. So the sales has become increasingly aggressive, and that's actually turned off a lot of customers on the other side. And so that also means that you have to be really careful and thoughtful in terms of how you engage with the customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always different challenges, right? And I think that rarely what used to work still works. That's kind of a constant theme in like everything. So you kind of have to find new channels, new ways to reach people, new approaches. On the consumer side, this happens where a specific channel or source becomes saturated, right? So like there was so many businesses built on the back of AdWords back in the day. And then now it's like to really build a business on AdWords, you're paying these huge prices. Mm-hmm. But so the arbitrage opportunity was earlier in the market. And eventually the market sort of recognizes the actual market price. And so it just becomes harder to actually create and extract value from that. So you sort of have to find new places, new ways to do that.
Yeah, and I think I think developer first. I think there's a lot of promise there. You have to approach it the right way. If you just think I'm going to make an open source project and I'm going to throw it up on GitHub and then magically stuff is going to happen, like that's not the way that these things work. You have to be very thoughtful around how you approach it, but especially like nowadays, it used to be that a lot of things were top down in IT departments and enterprise. Now you see a lot more kind of developer focus, with DevOps and everything else, in terms of them making the decisions about some of the tools that you use or these type of things. So I think there's a lot of value in providing, this type of developer first, but again, like you have to do it in a really careful way.
Yeah, of course, right? I think you have to respect your buyer. I think that's the most important part. You respect the customer, respect what they're doing. Like you can't be too aggressive. You can't talk down to them. There's a lot, because you want these people to respect you and to buy from you, and you have to show them respect in order to make that happen. So
yes, absolutely.
Cool. So what else are you thinking about? What's kind of next on your agenda for UnifyID, or for what else are you seeing coming out of academia? What's exciting for you right now?
Gosh, there's, here at the company, like I mentioned, we got started in 2016. We've been working on the technology for a while. This is just personally, I very much want to see this problem get solved. I mean, that's really the motivation behind doing the company. Saw that there's there's a business opportunity there, but more fundamentally, it's just, oh, come on, guys, we can do this in a much better way. This is especially why I'm especially passionate around, just moving off of really bad forms of authentication, like your SMSs or mother's maiden name or security questions. You don't have to go full passwordless yet, but at least move off in that direction. And so like much of the stuff we're doing is to try to support those. Like I mentioned, like we have a aggressive price point around our push to auth service. And, again, it's just like trying to drive that type of adoption. That part is really important for us for 2020. Just looking at the broader landscape of enterprise. So enterprise software has always been this this area of huge potential that is still and will continue to be underserved. Because, when you think about startups and like people starting companies and doing new innovative things, most of that energy is focused on the consumer market. And if you look at on the enterprise side, there's large, and I would argue even larger opportunities than on the consumer side, but there's much less of a focus on that side just because there's not as many people who are familiar with it, and it's a little bit of a foreign concept for individuals. Like an individual, if you're an entrepreneur and you use your own products all the time, you understand those, but unless you've done something within enterprise or worked with in the enterprise space before, you don't necessarily understand or are comfortable with the needs of the enterprise, because it really is a very different beast than consumer. When we look for hiring, for example, and people in product and engineering and other places, we really value that enterprise experience because it's such a different beast than we see on the consumer side. And so I think that what that means is that the pool of entrepreneurs and ideas and innovation is smaller. And so I think that means that the enterprise market is going to continue to be underserved, even though there's a massive opportunity there. And I think investors see that as well. The investors are always interested in enterprise. Not all, even on the VC side, there's not that many VCs that really truly understand enterprise. But the ones that do, I think are and are able to identify the real opportunities there, identify the teams that can execute and win versus the ones that won't, they're going to win out big. The other thing around enterprise is that these things take a long time. I mentioned from my first company, it was 10 years start to finish. I heard a metric that the median time for an outcome, in terms of IPO or acquisition for a successful enterprise company, is 10.7 years. So from start to finish. So you have on the consumer side, especially, you hear these stories about these companies that get acquired in 18 months, 24 months, these type of things. The enterprise one is a much longer haul. And so I think, again, that kind of maybe people shy away from it a little bit more, but the demand has not gone away and will only increase. Because I mentioned around authentication and risk and fraud, the majority of those costs are borne by the organizations. And so they have a desperate need to solve these problems. Individuals, it's fine. I lost my password, but they ultimately don't end up paying for that. It's the organizations that do. And I think that's the same is going to be true, where both the liabilities and the opportunities are going to be very much on the enterprise side. That's going to continue to happen and only increase. And I think the supply, because of the nature of enterprise and the fact there's not as many people who are familiar with it, the supply on that side is still going to be limited, which means I think that there's going to be a lot of great opportunities on the enterprise side.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's one of the goals of Enterprise Ready in this show, is to try to encourage more folks to understand enterprise and kind of get the knowledge and be able to dive in. And so, because it's hard to hire people with enterprise software experience if the prerequisite for everyone is that everyone have enterprise software experience, right? So we need folks to be able to come in and not have had that much experience, but have some knowledge shared with them beforehand. So hopefully we're helping to build that future.
Yes, I hope so. Yeah.
Awesome. John, thanks so much for your time. This was amazing. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for having me. It was a great time and great conversation.
That's all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, or just to learn more about enterprise features, find us at EnterpriseReady.io. To learn more about Heavybit, visit Heavybit.com to check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks on sales, marketing, product, and general management from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders. This podcast is also brought to you by my company, Replicated, where we enable cloud-native software vendors like HashiCorp, CircleCI, Sneak, and many others to operationalize and scale the distribution of their modern on-prem applications to the largest enterprise customers. Check us out at replicated.com.